On a cold city street, a man sat in silence, his only companion a loyal dog curled at his side. To the world, he was just another homeless soul, ignored, invisible. But when a group of thugs decided to rob and humiliate him, they made one fatal mistake. They had no idea who they were really messing with. Because beneath the worn clothes and quiet demeanor was a legend, Big Shaq. A powerhouse. A man who never forgets. And tonight, karma wasn't just coming. It was knocking hard. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. A cold breeze swept through the nearly deserted sidewalk, rattling the old newspaper scraps and discarded coffee cups that littered the pavement. The streetlights flickered lazily, casting uneven pools of dim light along the curb, where a man sat in stillness. His clothes were worn, layers of fabric clinging to his frame in an attempt to battle the creeping chill of the city night. He pulled his tattered coat tighter around his broad shoulders, a subtle movement that betrayed no discomfort, no plea for warmth, just quiet resilience. Beside him, his companion lay curled, a German shepherd with an alert posture, ears twitching at every distant sound. The dog was lean but not malnourished, his coat rough but well kept. There was something about the way he watched, the way his sharp amber eyes tracked the movement of pedestrians hurrying past, their gazes deliberately averted. They walked quickly, gripping their bags a little tighter, their steps a little faster as they passed the man and his dog. To them, he was just another beggar, one of many scattered along the city's veins, another forgotten face in a world that had no time for the unfortunate. A young woman in a sleek navy blue coat hesitated as she neared. Her fingers brushed the pocket of her purse, where a few stray bills lay folded. She slowed, casting a glance at the man, her conscience at war with her instinct to keep moving. His face was partially hidden beneath the shadow of his hood, but there was something about him, something familiar, yet unplaceable. Before she could decide, the traffic light at the intersection turned red, forcing her forward. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding and moved on, telling herself that he would be fine. The man didn't reach out, didn't call after her, or extend a desperate hand. Instead, he simply remained as he was, silent, still, unmoving. The night deepened, and with it, the city's energy shifted. The busy sidewalks of the day gave way to the unpredictability of nighttime wanderers. A group of young men stumbled out of a bar across the street, their laughter carrying through the crisp air. One of them nudged another, jerking his chin toward the man on the sidewalk. "Look at this guy," he snickered. "Man, life's rough, huh?" His friend laughed along, but their amusement wasn't cruel. It was detached, indifferent. They didn't stop, didn't engage. They simply moved past, carried away by the current of their own world, where this man and his dog were nothing more than background scenery. A pair of older women, both dressed in practical coats, walked together, their conversation lowering as they neared. One of them stole a glance at the man before whispering, "You think he's dangerous?" Her companion shook her head, her gaze lingering on the dog. "I don't think so. Just sad, that's all." Yet neither of them spoke to him. Neither of them stopped. They walked on, their voices rising again as they discussed their plans for the morning. The man remained motionless, but his eyes, hidden beneath the hood's shadow, were awake, watching everything. His dog let out a small huff, shifting slightly, but still stayed close. His body relaxed, but ready. Across the street, an old vendor was closing up his stall, packing away unsold hot dogs and pretzels. He hesitated for a moment, then reached into his cart, pulling out a wrapped sandwich. With a slow, deliberate pace, he crossed the street and approached the man. "Hey," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Got some extra food?" The man lifted his gaze, and for the briefest moment, their eyes met. Something flickered in the vendor's expression. An odd sense of recognition, like an almost forgotten memory brushing against the edges of his mind. He squinted, then shook his head slightly, brushing it off. The man nodded once in quiet gratitude and accepted the food. The vendor didn't linger. He turned, hands in his coat pockets, and walked away into the city's quiet hum. The dog's tail thumped lightly against the pavement. A car rolled to a slow stop at the traffic light nearby, music pulsing from within. A sleek black vehicle, tinted windows. The driver glanced toward the sidewalk and frowned slightly, as if trying to place a memory. He reached for his phone, tapping on the screen, before the light turned green and he drove off into the night. The man took a slow breath. He didn't eat immediately. He simply sat there listening, feeling the weight of the city press down around him. Because he knew. He knew that the world had already decided who he was. A nameless figure on the street. A story no one cared to hear. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that they had no idea who they were really walking past. And soon, they would find out. The city at night had a different pulse, a restless energy that belonged to those who didn't fit in the daylight. The sidewalks were emptier, but the shadows were fuller, holding on to secrets the sun would never see. It was in this shifting darkness that a group of young men roamed, their laughter loud, their voices thick with the arrogance of privilege. They weren't just drunk on the liquor they had consumed. They were intoxicated by their own invincibility, the kind that came from knowing the world had never truly told them no. At the center of the group was their leader, a tall, sharp-featured young man named Jackson Crowley, the kind of kid whose last name opened doors he never even had to knock on. His father owned half the real estate in the city, and his mother's name was synonymous with old money. Jackson had never worked a day in his life, never worried about consequences. Rules bent around him, and people moved aside when he walked. And if they didn't, well, he made sure they did. "Man, this city is boring," Jackson drawled, stretching his arms as he led his pack of friends down the quiet street. "We should have hit that rooftop party. This place is dead." Behind him, Griff, his right-hand man, smirked. "We could always make our own fun." The others laughed, feeding off each other's recklessness, their presence infecting the street like an unshakable cold. They kicked over an abandoned traffic cone, sent an empty soda can clattering against the pavement. Their footsteps echoed with entitlement. That was when Jackson saw him. The figure sitting alone, hunched beneath the glow of a dying street lamp. A man whose face was hidden by a low hood, with a large dog curled up beside him. A slow smirk stretched across Jackson's face. "Boys," he said, stopping in his tracks. "Would you look at this?" The others followed his gaze. At first, they barely reacted. Homeless people were part of the scenery, like cracked sidewalks and overflowing trash cans. Forgettable, invisible. But then, Griff let out a low chuckle. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" Jackson's smirk widened. "Let's have some fun." The group veered off their path, making their way toward the man and his dog. Shaq didn't move as the footsteps approached. He had heard them from a block away, the distinct rhythm of entitled youth. He could tell by their voices that they weren't just another group of passers-by. They were looking for something, and from experience, he knew exactly what that meant. The dog, however, didn't need years of wisdom to sense the shift in the air. He lifted his head, ears pricking forward, a deep growl vibrating in his throat. Jackson laughed. "Look at this mutt, acting like he's gonna do something." One of the guys, Lance, whistled. "That thing looks like it could rip a man's throat out." Jackson tilted his head. "I doubt it. Dogs take after their owners. And from where I'm standing..." He leaned down slightly, a sneer curling his lips. "This one looks weak." Shaq didn't respond, didn't flinch. He just exhaled softly, the kind of patience that made the night itself feel heavier. Jackson wasn't used to being ignored. "Hey, old man." He nudged Shaq's boot with his foot. "I'm talking to you." The dog's growl deepened, but Shaq placed a steady hand on its back, a silent command that kept the animal from reacting further. Griff shook his head, laughing. "Man, this guy's out of it. Bet he doesn't even know where he is." Jackson's amusement faded slightly. He didn't like it when people didn't play along. He liked reactions, fear, annoyance, even anger. But this silence, it unsettled him in a way he didn't understand, and that made him angry. "Come on, man," Jackson scoffed, stepping closer. "Aren't you even going to ask for money? Maybe do a little sob story for us?" He pulled a crumpled 20 from his pocket and dangled it. "Come on, dance for it." Griff snorted. "You really think he can dance?" Jackson laughed. You're right. Maybe he could bark for it, though. Bet the mutt could teach him how. The others erupted into laughter, their voices echoing against the empty buildings. Jackson flicked the bill, letting it flutter down onto Shaq's lap like a cruel joke. Go on, big guy. That's more than you'll see in a month. Shaq didn't move. He simply sat there, unmoved, his face unreadable beneath the hood. Jackson's patience snapped. He wasn't used to being dismissed, especially not by someone he considered beneath him. All right, he muttered, stepping back and stretching his arms. Guess we gotta make this fun ourselves. Before anyone could react, he kicked the dog's food bowl. The metal clattered against the pavement, scattering the last bits of kibble into the street. The laughter died immediately. The dog sprang to its feet, its growl turning into a sharp, warning bark. But it wasn't just the dog that changed. The air itself shifted. Shaq moved, not much, just the faintest tilt of his head. But it was enough. Jackson's smirk wavered for the first time. Something about the man's presence had changed, a ripple in the stillness that even Jackson, in all his arrogance, could feel. It was like standing too close to a sleeping lion, only to realize the lion wasn't sleeping at all. Whoa, Lance muttered. Jax? Jackson scoffed, masking his unease. Relax. What's he gonna do? Shaq slowly reached down, picking up the empty bowl. He turned it over in his hands, examining it as if it held the secrets of the universe. Then, with deliberate patience, he set it back down beside the dog and looked up. The hood slipped slightly, just enough for Jackson to see a glimpse of his face, just enough for the dim streetlight to catch the deep-set eyes, the sharp angles of his features, and just like that, the world tilted. Jackson froze. Something about the man's face. Something familiar. Something he had seen before. But not like this. Not in the dark. Not in the silence of a city street. Griff noticed it too. Wait a minute. Shaq said nothing. He just looked at them. But suddenly they felt like the ones on the wrong side of something. Jackson's heart pounded in his chest, a strange, creeping realization settling over him. No way. This was just some homeless guy. Just some nobody, wasn't it? And yet, why did it feel like they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives? The silence between Shaq and the group of young men stretched longer than any of them had expected. It was thick, humming with an unspoken weight, like the moment just before a storm when the air becomes too still, too charged. The dog stood tense beside him, its ears pinned back, eyes locked onto Jackson. The scattered kibble on the pavement was a stark reminder of the disrespect these men had shown. Not just to the dog, but to the quiet dignity of the man beside him. But Shaq didn't react. And that made Jackson furious. He wasn't used to this complete and utter lack of acknowledgement. Most people would have scrambled, begged, or at the very least, gotten angry. But this man? He sat there, unmoved, like nothing they did mattered. And that was unacceptable. Jackson let out a sharp, humorless laugh. You really don't get it, do you? He nudged Griff with his elbow. This guy thinks he's better than us, just sitting there like some Zen monk or whatever. Griff, emboldened by Jackson's growing irritation, grinned. Nah, he's just slow. Bet he doesn't even know what's happening. Shaq still didn't say a word. All right, fine, Jackson muttered. Let's wake him up then. Without hesitation, he bent down and snatched up Shaq's backpack. The moment the strap left the ground, the dog barked sharply, stepping forward, its muscles coiled. Jackson jerked back on instinct, nearly stumbling, but quickly covered his reaction with a smirk. Whoa, easy there, Cujo, he taunted, waving the bag just out of reach. What's in here, huh? A lifetime supply of disappointment? The group laughed, feeding off the moment, their voices bouncing off the empty street. Griff grabbed the bag from Jackson and unzipped it, dumping its contents onto the sidewalk without a second thought. A worn sweatshirt, a few small bills, barely enough for a meal, a water bottle, a folded piece of paper with handwriting too faint to read in the dim light. Nothing valuable, nothing worth taking. But that wasn't the point anymore. Jackson crossed his arms. Man, this is depressing. Even his dog has better stuff than him. Griff kicked the water bottle, sending it rolling into the gutter. Another guy, Bo, picked up the sweatshirt and held it up like it was some kind of diseased rag. You actually wear this? Bo sneered, tossing it onto the pavement like trash. No wonder you're out here. Still, Shaq didn't move. The lack of reaction burned at Jackson like an itch he couldn't scratch. He wanted something, anger, fear, anything. But this guy wasn't giving it to him. He was just sitting there, like none of this even mattered. And that was unacceptable. Jackson's eyes flickered to the dog. The only thing this man seemed to care about. A slow, smug smile crept onto his face as an idea took shape. All right, fine, Jackson said, shrugging. Since you're not much for conversation, I guess we'll have to talk to your friend here. Before anyone could react, he reached for the dog's collar. The reaction was immediate. The German shepherd snarled, snapping at the air between them, its bark booming in the empty street. Jackson jerked back again, but this time, the grin on his face faltered. The dog's eyes burned into him, and, for the first time all night, Jackson felt something unfamiliar curl in his gut. Not fear, not exactly, but something close. And then, for the first time that night, Shaq moved. It was subtle, barely anything at all. But he simply lifted his head, just enough for the streetlight to cast its glow across the sharp lines of his face. Jackson saw him, really saw him, and for a split second, his breath caught in his throat. Something about that face. It was too familiar, too recognizable, like a ghost from a past life staring back at him. He had seen that face before, not on a sidewalk, not in the shadows of some forgotten street, but somewhere bigger, brighter. Number. No, that was impossible. Jackson blinked, shaking off the thought. There was no way. No way this guy was who he thought he was. You... His voice cracked slightly, but he covered it quickly. You think you're some kind of tough guy, huh? His bravado returned with a vengeance, desperate to stamp out whatever unsettling feeling had just crept into his mind. Griff picked up on Jackson's shifting energy and, sensing an opportunity, pulled out his phone. Yo, he grinned. We should record this. Jackson hesitated for half a second. Then, his smirk returned. Yeah, he nodded, stepping back. Yeah, let's make this guy famous. Griff hit record, and the camera lens glowed red. Jackson turned back to Shaq, fully in control again, and gestured to the dog's empty food bowl on the ground. All right, big guy, he said, his voice mocking. Here's the deal. If you want to get your stuff back, you gotta do something for us. Griff zoomed in, laughing. Dude, make him beg. That'd be hilarious. Jackson grinned. Yeah, beg. The others roared with laughter, their jeers bouncing off the buildings. Still, Shaq didn't move, didn't react, didn't give them anything. Griff's laughter started to die down, so did the others. The silence grew awkward, uncomfortable. Jackson's smile twitched. What's the matter, man? He pressed, his tone growing sharper. Too proud? Too stupid? Come on, you've got nothing left to lose. The camera kept rolling. More people walked past now, drawn in by the scene. Some paused, some even pulled out their phones, but no one stepped in. No one said anything. It was just another night in the city, another group of rich kids screwing around with someone beneath them. And then, Shaq did something they never expected. He smiled. Not a big smile. Not even a particularly noticeable one. Just a small, knowing smirk. Like he knew something they didn't. Like he wasn't the one being humiliated. They were. And just like that, the balance of power shifted. Jackson's smirk vanished. Something cold crawled up his spine. Something he couldn't explain. His grip on the moment, on the control he had, loosened. The dog let out a soft huff, almost as if it was laughing too. For the first time all night, Jackson felt like maybe, just maybe, he had just made a mistake. The laughter had faded. The taunts had turned into nothing more than noise swallowed by the restless city. The cold pavement beneath Shaq felt familiar now. Too familiar. But it wasn't the concrete that chilled him. It was the weight of something heavier, something unseen, pressing down on his chest. Memories. They came quietly at first, creeping in like shadows slipping through cracks in a door. But then, they hit like a wave. A past that refused to stay buried. It had been years since Shaquille O'Neal had last stepped onto a court, the roar of a packed arena vibrating in his bones, the bright lights painting his skin in gold and glory. The world had known him as Big Shaq, the unstoppable giant, the force no one could match. Championships, endorsements, money flowing in like a never-ending tide. He had everything, until he didn't. It wasn't the fame that had broken him, not the money, not the pressure. He had been built for those things. It was something else. It had started small, the whispers in boardrooms, the side conversations behind closed doors. Shaq had always believed that with success came loyalty. That the people closest to him, the ones who cheered for him, worked for him, even loved him, would never turn on him. But money makes people forget who they are. And betrayal comes in the quietest moments. He could still hear the voice of his financial advisor, a man he had trusted for over a decade, explaining in cold, sterile words how millions had disappeared, the investments that had been made on his behalf, the contracts that had been signed without his approval. "You're not broke," the man had said, shifting uncomfortably in his chair, avoiding Shaq's eyes. "But things aren't what they used to be. Things weren't what they used to be." That sentence had haunted him, not because he had lost money. He had more than enough to live 1,000 lifetimes, but because he had been lied to, cheated, by people he called family. Shaq blinked, dragging himself back to the present. The city lights blurred as his thoughts swirled. His hands, the same hands that had once lifted championship trophies, now rested on his dog's back, feeling the steady rise and fall of its breathing. The betrayal had changed him. Not in anger, not in resentment, but in understanding. He had walked away. From all of it. The cameras, the endorsements, the endless cycle of wealth and power. Not because he had to, but because he needed to see the world without the shield of fame protecting him. So he had stepped into the streets, to feel the weight of life from the ground level, to understand the struggle not from the lens of a millionaire giving to charity, but from the eyes of those who had nothing. His mother's voice echoed in his mind, soft but firm, like it always had been. "Money can buy everything but character, baby." Lucille O'Neal had raised him to be humble, to never forget where he came from. But somewhere along the way, he had lost that connection. Not because he had changed, but because the world around him had. People had stopped talking to him like a man and started treating him like a brand. And when you become a brand, you stop being a person. So he had disappeared. No press releases, no announcements, just vanished from the world he had once dominated. And no one had looked for him. At first, it had stung. Then, it had opened his eyes. Shaq exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cold air. He glanced down at the empty food bowl beside him, then at his dog, who was watching him as if sensing the weight of his thoughts. He reached down and gently scratched behind the dog's ears, a silent reassurance more for himself than for the animal. The truth was, this life, this version of himself sitting on a cold sidewalk with nothing but a backpack and a loyal companion, felt more real than anything he had ever known. Because out here there were no cameras, no deals, just people. People who ignored him, people who pitied him, people who never recognized who he really was. And that was the greatest lesson of all. Because if a man like him, a millionaire, a legend, a name that had once been spoken in every household, could sit here, invisible, forgotten, then what about the men and women who had never been known at all? Shaq had learned more in the past few years than he ever had in a lifetime of wealth. He had seen kindness in places he never expected. A tired waitress slipping an extra piece of bread onto his plate when she thought no one was looking. A construction worker giving him his only bottle of water on a scorching day, even when the man himself had barely enough. But he had also seen cruelty. The way people looked through him rather than at him. The way some crossed the street to avoid him, as if poverty was contagious. He had listened to stories from men who had once been fathers, husbands, sons, now reduced to ghosts in their own city. Not criminals, not addicts, just forgotten. And now, he was one of them. Not because he had to be, but because he chose to be. Because understanding the world from the bottom up was the only way to change it. A gust of wind swept down the street, rattling the few belongings scattered at his feet from the encounter earlier. the remnants of Jackson's mockery. The memory of the young men's laughter echoed in his mind, blending with the voices of men in boardrooms, of financial advisors with careful words, of brand executives who had once dictated his worth. They were all the same. People who believed they had power simply because they had control. But what they didn't understand, what they never understood, was that true power doesn't come from money. It comes from knowing who you are when everything is stripped away. And Shaq knew exactly who he was. The dog shifted beside him, pressing its head into his leg. Shaq smiled faintly, running a hand over its fur. He had nothing to prove to those boys. Not now. But soon, they would understand. They had no idea who they had mocked tonight. But they were about to find out. The diner sat on the corner of a busy street, its neon sign flickering against the night sky. Inside, the hum of conversation mixed with the low buzz of a flickering TV mounted near the counter. The place smelled of coffee, grease, and old vinyl booths that had seen better days. Jackson and his crew strolled in like they owned the place, laughing loudly as they slid into a booth near the window. Griff tossed his phone onto the table, the red recording light still blinking as he scrolled through the footage they had just taken. The video wasn't long, but it was cruel, and that made it hilarious, to them at least. "Man," Griff snorted, shaking his head. "Did you see his face? Dude looked like he didn't even care." Jackson leaned back, stretching his arms over the booth. "That's what made it so funny. Some people just accept their fate, I guess." Lance grabbed a handful of fries from the basket in the center of the table. "Yeah, but the best part was that mutt. I thought it was going to tear your arm off when you went for it." Jackson smirked, shaking his head. "Nah, that dog wasn't going to do a damn thing. Just like its owner, they're both pathetic." The group burst into laughter again, their voices rising above the soft chatter of other late-night diners. A few people glanced their way, but no one said anything. No one ever did. Griff tapped his phone screen, pulling up social media. "Yo, I'm about to post this," he said, grinning. "Let's see how fast this goes viral." Jackson leaned in, watching as Griff uploaded the video. Within seconds, comments started rolling in. "Damn, this is cold. LOL, dude didn't even react. That dog had more fight in him than the owner. Man, rich kids have no chill." Jackson laughed, pleased with the reaction. "Give it a few hours," he said. "This'll be all over the place." But not in the way he expected. An old man sat at the counter of a nearly empty bar, nursing a cup of black coffee. His name was Hank Lawson, a retired police officer who had spent decades working these streets. He had seen it all, the good, the bad, and the ugly. He wasn't much for social media, but his grandson had shown him how to check the news on his phone. He scrolled aimlessly, stopping when a video caught his eye. It was grainy, but the moment he saw the massive figure sitting on the sidewalk, something clicked in his mind. He narrowed his eyes, leaning in closer as the scene played out, the laughter, the taunting, the way the man barely reacted. And then, the face. Even partially hidden under the hood, Hank recognized him instantly. His breath caught. No way. He replayed the video, this time pausing at the moment where the streetlight hit the man's face. It was him. Shaquille O'Neal. Hank had met him years ago, back when Shaq was still in his prime, still larger than life. Even back then, he had a presence that couldn't be ignored. To see him now, on the streets, being mocked by a bunch of punks? Hank set his cup down hard, causing the bartender to glance his way. Hank didn't care. He was already pulling up his contacts. There was someone he needed to call. Within an hour, the video had traveled far beyond Jackson's social circle. It spread like wildfire, hitting forums, sports blogs, and fan pages. People started recognizing him, connecting the dots. Comments took a sharp turn. "Wait, is that Shaq? No freaking way. That's Shaquille O'Neal. These kids really thought they could humiliate Shaq?" This just went from funny to straight up disgusting. By the time Jackson and his crew finished their food, the tide had already turned. They just didn't know it yet. Jackson stretched, satisfied. "Man, tonight was too easy," he muttered. "People like that. They don't fight back. That's why they end up where they are." Griff, still scrolling through his phone, suddenly went still. His face paled slightly. Lance frowned. Yo, what's up? Griff swallowed. I think we screwed up. Jackson snorted. What? The dude's not gonna do anything. He's probably still sitting there, staring into space. No, dude, Griff said, voice tight. It's not about him. It's about us. He turned the screen so Jackson could see. The same video they had uploaded was now being reposted by massive accounts, but this time, the captions weren't laughing with them. They were dragging them. Jackson's smirk faded. He grabbed the phone, scrolling through the thousands of comments, his chest tightening. People weren't mocking the homeless man anymore. They were furious at Jackson and his crew. Lance let out a low whistle. Damn, that's bad. Bo, who had been unbothered until now, shifted in his seat. So what? Some people are mad. It's the internet. It'll blow over. But Griff wasn't convinced. Dude, they're tagging celebrities, journalists, even the police. Jackson's stomach dropped. Then, as if on cue, his phone buzzed. His father's name flashed on the screen. His heart pounded. Jackson stepped out of the booth, answering the call with forced confidence. Hey, Dad, what the hell did you do? Jackson winced, pulling the phone slightly away from his ear. Relax, it's just... No, you don't get to tell me to relax, his father snapped. Do you have any idea what you've done? That man you and your idiot friends humiliated? That's Shaquille O'Neal. Shaq Jackson's mouth went dry. He's one of the most respected athletes in the world. Do you know how many people admire him? How many people have his back? Jackson's throat tightened. I didn't know. You didn't know. You didn't think. His father's voice was ice. Your little stunt is everywhere. My phone hasn't stopped ringing. Clients are pulling deals. Our stock is dipping. Do you have any idea what you've done to this family? Jackson had never heard his father sound like this. For the first time in his life, he felt something he never had before. Real fear. Shaq sat quietly in a small diner across town, sipping a cup of coffee. He had seen the video. He had seen the comments. He knew exactly what was coming next. His dog sat at his feet, tail wagging lazily. He reached down, scratching behind its ears. Told you, boy. He smiled slightly. Karma always does the heavy lifting. Griff, sitting across from him, wasn't much better. His leg bounced under the table, his face pale. Bro, this is bad, he muttered, running a hand over his face. Like, really bad. Lance shifted uncomfortably beside him, scrolling through his own feed. They're tagging news stations now, he murmured. This is blowing up way too fast. Jackson barely heard them. His father's words were still ringing in his ears. Do you have any idea what you've done? The weight of it settled in his chest like a stone. This wasn't like the usual trouble he got into, the kind his dad could make disappear with a phone call. This was public, and worse, it was personal to people. And then, just when Jackson thought the night couldn't get any worse, a shadow fell across their booth. Well, a voice drawled. Aren't you boys in for a surprise? Jackson looked up. The man standing before them was not someone he recognized, but something about him screamed authority. He was tall, dressed in an expensive black suit, his salt and pepper hair slicked back with precision. His confidence was unsettling, like a man who already knew how this conversation was going to end. He held up his phone, the screen glowing with the very same viral video that had turned Jackson's world upside down. And he smirked. Tell me, the man said casually, tilting his head. Do you kids have any idea who you just messed with? Griff let out a nervous chuckle. Yeah. Some homeless dude? Lance shifted beside him, not laughing. The man's smirk deepened, but his eyes, they stayed cold. Wrong answer, he said smoothly. Jackson straightened, his fists clenching under the table. Who the hell are you? He snapped. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slid into the booth across from them, completely uninvited, like he belonged there. He set his phone on the table and tapped the screen, making the paused video play once more. The grainy footage of them mocking a man who never flinched. The entire diner was quiet now. Conversations had stopped. People were watching. The man leaned forward, steepling his fingers. You really don't recognize him, do you? Jackson's stomach twisted. He didn't want to ask, didn't want to give this guy the satisfaction. But the silence stretched too long. And then finally the man said it. That's Shaquille O'Neal. The words landed like a punch. Jackson blinked, sure he had misheard. What? The man chuckled. Oh, don't tell me you don't know him. Big Shaq, 4-time NBA champion, Hall of Famer, business mogul, television personality, millionaire. Hell, probably a billionaire by now. You and your little friends here didn't just harass some nobody on the street. He leaned in slightly, his smirk gone now. You humiliated one of the most powerful men in America. Jackson felt his chest tighten. Lance's fork slipped from his fingers, clattering against his plate. Griff swallowed hard. Bo, who had been silent until now, let out a breathy laugh. No way that was him. The man glanced at him, amused. You really think a man that size, with that presence, is just some ordinary guy? Jackson's mind raced, replaying the night over and over again. He had known something was off about the way the man didn't react, the way he sat there, like he was in control even when they were taunting him. And now, he realized, he had never been in control at all. The stranger watched the realization sink in, then leaned back in the booth looking almost bored. You boys screwed up, big time. Jackson felt his pulse hammering in his ears. So what? He forced out, his voice rough. It's not like we hurt him. The man let out a slow chuckle. You really don't get it, do you? He picked up his phone again, scrolled, then turned the screen back toward them. Jackson stared. It wasn't just random comments anymore. Celebrities were talking about it. Athletes, journalists, even politicians. And Shaq himself had finally responded. A simple post. No threats, no insults. Just a single line. I've seen the video. Let's see what happens next. Jackson's stomach dropped. That wasn't a statement. That was a warning. Griff let out a slow exhale, his hands shaking slightly as he ran them through his hair. Dude, we're so screwed. Lance rubbed his face, suddenly looking a little sick. His lawyers are probably already making calls. Not just his lawyers, the man in the suit said, sliding out of the booth and straightening his jacket. Shaq has friends everywhere. Business leaders, the media, people in every industry. You didn't just tick off some guy on the street. He adjusted his cufflinks, giving Jackson one last look. You pissed off a man who could ruin your entire lives with a single phone call. The group sat in stunned silence as the man turned to leave. But then, just as he reached the door, he paused and glanced back over his shoulder. Oh, he said casually, as if he had nearly forgotten. I'd start thinking about how to apologize. Fast. And then, with that final warning, he walked out into the night. Jackson felt the air leave his lungs. The reality of it all was finally crashing down on him. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a disaster. Shaq wasn't intimidated. He had been in rooms far more powerful than this. A young receptionist looked up, her mouth parting slightly in surprise as she recognized him. Shaq was used to that reaction. Most people weren't expecting to see a 7-foot legend in a hoodie and jeans strolling into a corporate headquarters. I have a meeting, he said simply, his voice deep and calm. The woman hesitated. With whom, sir? Before he could answer, a set of heavy footsteps approached from the hallway. A man in his late 50s, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, and wearing a suit worth more than most people's cars, stopped short when he saw Shaq. His lips pressed into a thin line. Mr. O'Neal, he said stiffly. I wasn't expecting you so soon. Shaq didn't offer a handshake. He simply studied the man for a long moment. This was Henry Crowley, a ruthless businessman, a man who had built an empire through sheer power and money. And, most importantly, Jackson's father. Shaq nodded toward the hallway. Let's talk. Henry led Shaq into his private office, a floor-to-ceiling view of the city stretching behind him. He gestured to a chair, but Shaq remained standing. Henry exhaled sharply, moving behind his desk. Listen, if this is about my son, it is. The older man's jaw tensed. I assume you're here for some kind of settlement, he said, reaching for a pen. I'll write the check, whatever you want. Shaq chuckled softly, shaking his head. That's not why I'm here. Henry frowned. Then what do you want? Shaq took his time before answering. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, carrying the weight of something far more important than money. I want you to fix your son. Henry flinched, just slightly. Excuse me? Shaq folded his arms. Jackson walks around this city like he owns it. He thinks money makes him untouchable. He thinks people like me, like the ones struggling on the streets, don't matter. You gave him that mindset. Henry's face darkened. Now, wait just a... Shaq cut him off. I'm not here to argue. I'm here to give you a choice. Henry fell silent, watching him. Shaq leaned forward, resting his large hands on the edge of the desk. I could take legal action. I could have the media on this story for weeks. You and I both know it wouldn't just hurt Jackson. It would hurt you, your business, your reputation. Henry's fingers curled into a fist on the desk. He knew Shaq was right. But I'm not gonna do that. Shaq straightened. Instead, I'm giving you a chance to show your son what real power looks like. Henry's eyes narrowed. And what does that mean? Shaq pulled out his phone, tapped a few times, then turned the screen toward Henry. It was a donation receipt. $5 million. To homeless shelters and rehabilitation programs across the city. Henry's breath caught. You just donated $5 million? Shaq nodded. And I want you to match it. Henry stared at him, completely thrown off. You came all this way for a donation request? Shaq shook his head. I came all this way to make sure your son sees it. I want him to understand that money doesn't make him powerful. What you do with it does. Henry looked away, his jaw tight. He had spent his whole life building Crowley Industries, teaching his son that power meant winning at all costs. And now, a man like Shaq, who had every right to destroy them, was standing in his office, offering him a different way out. A way that didn't involve humiliation or lawsuits, just change. For the first time in a long time, Henry Crowley felt ashamed. Later that afternoon, Jackson's phone buzzed with an incoming text. Come to the office. Now, Dad. He swallowed hard, his hands still shaking from the events of the past 24 hours. The internet was still on fire with the video. His name was trending, for all the wrong reasons. Dread coiled in his stomach as he walked into his father's office, stopping cold when he saw Shaq sitting there. His father stood behind the desk, his face unreadable. Sit. Jackson hesitated, then dropped into the chair opposite Shaq, avoiding his gaze. His father's voice was sharp. Do you have any idea what you've done? Jackson swallowed, keeping his eyes on the desk. I messed up. No, Shaq said calmly. You didn't mess up. You showed the world who you are. Jackson's stomach twisted. Henry exhaled, pinching the bridge of his nose. I've agreed to match Mr. O'Neal's donation, $5 million, to shelters across the city. Jackson's head snapped up. What? Shaq's eyes locked onto his. That money? That's what power looks like, not kicking over a dog's food bowl. Jackson felt sick. Henry folded his arms. And you're going to do something too. Jackson stiffened. What do you mean? His father glared. You're going to apologize, publicly. Jackson's skin went cold. Dad, not a pre-written statement, not some PR stunt. Henry's voice was firm. You are going to stand in front of the cameras, look into them, and tell the world exactly what you did, and why it was wrong. Jackson felt trapped. Shaq tilted his head, watching the internal battle play out across Jackson's face. Then he said quietly, but firmly, if you want people to forget what you did, you need to give them something else to remember. Jackson clenched his jaw. He wanted to argue. He wanted to run. But there was no way out of this. He had spent his whole life thinking he was untouchable. Now, sitting across from Shaquille O'Neal, he realized he had never been more wrong. The press conference was brutal. Jackson stood in front of the cameras, his voice shaking as he admitted to everything. He didn't try to shift blame. Didn't try to justify his actions. He owned them. And in doing so, he saw, maybe for the first time in his life, just how much damage he had caused. The world wasn't going to forgive him overnight, maybe ever. But as he walked away from the podium, his father at his side, he caught a glimpse of Shaq watching from the back of the room. The legend nodded once. A silent message. This was the first step. The rest was up to him. The weight of their actions didn't hit Jackson and his friends all at once. It crept in, slow and suffocating, in the spaces between their arrogance and silence. At first, they convinced themselves that the world would forget, that the headlines would fade, that life would return to normal. But the world didn't forget. Jackson couldn't open his phone without seeing his own face plastered across the internet. The viral video refused to die down. Even worse than the outrage were the messages, the ones that dug deeper than anger ever could. You showed your true colors. I hope one day you understand what it's like to have nothing. People like you never change. For the first time in his life, Jackson wasn't in control of the narrative. No amount of money, no carefully crafted PR statement could erase what he had done. And that scared him more than anything. A week later, Jackson found himself standing outside St. Vincent's homeless shelter, the place his father had donated to. He had been given a choice: show up and help, or watch his life fall apart. So here he was. His hands clenched into fists as he stared at the doors, feeling the burn of humiliation creep up his neck. Not from the world watching him, but from the realization that for the first time he was stepping into a place where his last name meant nothing. Griff, Lance, and Bo were supposed to come too. But only Griff had shown up. The others had refused. They'll move on, Bo had scoffed. This won't matter in a month. Let them be mad, Lance had added. Who cares? But Jackson, he wasn't sure anymore. You ready? Griff muttered beside him. Number Jackson swallowed hard and pushed the door open. The shelter was nothing like what Jackson expected. He thought it would be cold, depressing, a place full of people who had given up. Instead, it was alive. Voices filled the air, the smell of warm food drifting from the kitchen. Volunteers moved with purpose, handing out supplies, talking to people like they were more than just their circumstances. A woman with kind eyes approached them. You must be Jackson and Griff. Jackson nodded stiffly, shifting uncomfortably under her gaze. I'm Mariah, the shelter coordinator, she continued, her voice calm but firm. You're here to work. No cameras, no press, just you, showing up. Jackson hesitated, expecting judgment. But Mariah didn't look at him with anger, just expectation, like she was waiting to see who he really was. He exhaled. What do you need us to do? For hours, they worked, packing supplies, serving food, listening. At first, Jackson kept his head down, focusing on the motions. But then, he started hearing the stories. A man in his 50s, once a business owner, lost everything to medical bills. A mother with 2 kids ran from an abusive home, only to end up here. A teenage boy, barely older than Jackson, kicked out by his own parents for reasons no one should be forced to endure. None of them had chosen this life. Jackson felt sick. And then, he saw him. Sitting at the far end of the room, a massive figure with a familiar German shepherd at his feet. Shaq. Jackson's breath hitched. He had known this moment was coming. But still, facing him here was something else entirely. For a long moment, Shaq said nothing. Then, he gestured to the empty seat across from him. Jackson hesitated. Then, slowly, he sat. The shelter's noise faded, the moment stretching thick and heavy. Finally, Shaq spoke. Why are you really here? Jackson swallowed, gripping his hands together under the table. He could lie. He could say this was about proving he wasn't the villain everyone thought he was. But sitting here, face to face with the man he had mocked, in a place where no one had time for lies, he knew that wouldn't work. So instead, he told the truth. I don't know, Jackson admitted, his voice hoarse. I just don't want to be that guy anymore. Shaq studied him for a long moment. Then, to Jackson's surprise, he nodded. Good, Shaq said simply. Now prove it. Jackson kept showing up. Every morning before the cameras were even awake, before the city noticed, he worked. Not for redemption, but because for the first time he actually cared. Griff kept showing up too, quietly growing into someone neither of them had expected. But Lance and Bo? They never came. They moved on, just as they had planned. Laughed off the incident. Dismissed the outrage, until the world didn't let them. Bo lost a major job opportunity when the company refused to be associated with him. Lance found himself pushed out of circles that once welcomed him, because power and wealth could only shield him from so much. They chose to ignore what they had done, and in return, life refused to forget. Months later, Jackson stood outside the shelter, staring at the city lights. Everything had changed. He wasn't sure when exactly it happened, when this place stopped being a punishment and started being a second chance. A voice rumbled behind him. "You're still here." Jackson turned. "Shaq." Jackson nodded, rubbing the back of his neck. "Guess so." Shaq studied him for a moment, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. Jackson frowned. "What's this?" Shaq smirked. "Your next step." Jackson unfolded it, and his heart stopped. It was a job offer, from one of Shaq's companies. Jackson looked up, stunned. "You're giving me a job?" Shaq shrugged. "You earned it." Jackson's throat tightened. "Why?" Shaq's expression softened. "Because someone once gave me a second chance when I didn't deserve it." Jackson's grip tightened on the paper. This wasn't a handout. This was a challenge. And for the first time in his life, Jackson was ready to rise to it. The city had always been alive. A restless heartbeat of movement, voices and stories that never stopped unfolding. But for Shaq, the city had become something else. A lesson. A mirror. A mission. As he walked through the streets, the cold wind brushing against his skin, he felt a sense of quiet purpose settle deep in his bones. His hood was pulled low, his worn clothes still the same. To any stranger passing by, he was just another man blending into the background, and that was exactly how he wanted it. His dog trotted beside him, its sharp eyes scanning the sidewalk, ears twitching at every distant sound. They had walked these streets together for months now, and in that time, Shaq had learned more than he ever had, sitting in boardrooms or bright TV studios. He had seen the truth of the world, the way people avoided eye contact when they walked past the homeless, the way some offered kindness without expecting anything in return, while others laughed at those who had nothing. The way power, real power, wasn't in how much money a person had, but in what they chose to do with it. A small cafe on the corner was just starting to open for the morning. Shaq stopped outside, leaning against the cold brick wall, watching as the owner set up the outdoor seating. The man, Eddie, was in his 60s, his hands worn from years of hard work. He had been one of the first people to show Shaq kindness when he started walking these streets. "Back again, huh?" Eddie called out, glancing at him with knowing eyes. Shaq nodded. "Just passing through." Eddie wiped his hands on his apron. "You know, I've been seeing a lot about that video. The one with those kids." Shaq's lips twitched slightly. "Yeah?" Eddie crossed his arms, studying him. "They finally figured out who you were." Shaq exhaled, his breath visible in the morning air. "Took them long enough?" Eddie chuckled. "You're a strange one, Shaq. Most people with your kind of money wouldn't spend a second on these streets, let alone choose to be here." Shaq looked down at his dog, scratching behind its ears. "Most people don't know what it feels like to have nothing." His voice was quiet. "I needed to understand it." Eddie nodded slowly, like he understood more than he let on. "And? What did you find?" Shaq looked out at the city, at the people rushing past, at the ones who had no place to go, at the small kindnesses and quiet struggles happening all around them. "I found out that the world is exactly what you make it," he said. Shaq had always known that money alone couldn't fix the world, but money in the right hands, that could change lives. His donation to the homeless shelters had been just the start. Since then, he had funded rehabilitation programs, job placement initiatives, and mental health services for those who had been forgotten by society. But it wasn't just about throwing money at a problem. It was about being there, about showing up. He had spent time with veterans who had lost everything after serving their country, with young runaways who had nowhere to go, with families forced onto the streets because of one bad stroke of luck. He listened. He learned, and he realized that if the world wasn't going to help these people, he would. Shaq pushed off the wall and started walking again. He didn't know exactly where he was going, but that was the beauty of it. The journey wasn't meant to have an end. His work wasn't finished. Not yet. As he crossed an intersection, he caught sight of a young man standing outside a shelter, staring at the entrance like it was a door he wasn't sure he was allowed to walk through. Jackson. Shaq watched from a distance as Jackson hesitated, his shoulders stiff with tension. The kid had been coming here for weeks now, working at the shelter, slowly learning what it meant to rebuild. But today, he looked unsure, like he was standing at a crossroads. Shaq didn't approach him. He just stood there, watching, waiting. Then, Jackson took a deep breath and stepped inside. A small smile played at the corner of Shaq's lips. Good. Some people needed to hit rock bottom to understand what really mattered. Some needed to break before they could rebuild, but redemption was always a choice, and Jackson had just made his. Shaq turned down another street, the early morning sun warming his back. His dog stayed close, its tail wagging slightly. Most people still didn't recognize him, but that didn't bother him, because this wasn't about recognition. It never had been. It was about something bigger, about understanding, about action, about walking in the world, not above it. A few feet away, a young woman knelt beside an older homeless man, handing him a cup of coffee. She didn't know Shaq was watching. She wasn't doing it for praise. She was just being kind. Shaq nodded to himself, adjusting his hood as he kept walking, because at the end of the day it wasn't about wealth, fame, or status. It was about the quiet choices people made when they thought no one was watching. And those choices, they were the only thing that ever really mattered. Some stories aren't just meant to be heard, they're meant to change you. Kindness is a choice. Power is in how you use it. And the smallest actions can create the biggest ripples. Next time you walk past someone society ignores, ask yourself, are you the one who looks away, or the one who makes a difference? Because in the end, the way you treat others is the only thing the world will ever remember.